The night Martha Keating walked into the Sweetwater Creek Frontier Social in the autumn of 1883, every head in the room turned, and not a single one of them turned with kindness. She had known it would be this way. She had stood at the cracked mirror above her wash basin for nearly 20 minutes that evening, telling herself it would be different, that perhaps people had short memories, that perhaps the story had grown tired enough in the retelling that the town of Sweetwater Creek would find some other poor soul to gossip about by now. She had smoothed the fabric of her blue calico dress, the best one she owned, and she had pinned a small ivory brooch at her collar, and she had told herself she looked respectable. She had told herself she deserved to go. But the moment she stepped through the wide double doors of the Grange Hall, the fiddle music that had been swelling bright and lively seemed to thin out at the edges, and the conversations near the entrance dropped low, and she felt the familiar cold tide of judgment wash over her from every direction. Martha Keating was 26 years old, and she had been married once, briefly and disastrously, to a man named Gerald Prout who had taken her money, taken her dignity, and then taken himself off to parts unknown, leaving behind nothing but a foreclosure notice on the little homestead she had scrimped 3 years to help build, and a reputation that had been dragged through every parlor and dry goods store in Sweetwater Creek like a rag through muddy water. Divorced women in 1883 were not simply unfortunate, they were suspect. They were evidence of something gone fundamentally wrong, and the question that sat unspoken in every set of narrowed eyes was always the same. What did she do to drive him away? She had done nothing. She had cooked and cleaned and planted and harvested and mended and smiled and prayed, and Gerald Prout had still left. But that truth was inconvenient, and inconvenient truths had a way of getting lost in small frontier towns, replaced by stories that were more satisfying, more complete, more comfortable for the people who were not living them. She took a breath and walked toward the refreshment table. Edna Calloway intercepted her before she had gone 10 steps. Edna was the wife of the mill owner and the undisputed social authority of Sweetwater Creek, a tall, angular woman with sharp eyes and a smile that never quite reached them. "Martha," Edna said, in that tone that managed to be both greeting and warning simultaneously, "I didn't expect to see you this evening." "Good evening, Edna," Martha said. She kept her voice even. She had practiced that too. "Of course, the social is open to everyone," Edna continued, and she let that word everyone sit in the air between them for just a moment too long, freighted with implications. "Though I do think it might be somewhat awkward for you. Several of Gerald's former business associates are in attendance tonight." "Gerald's former business associates are welcome to enjoy themselves," Martha said. "As am I." Edna's smile thinned. She moved away, and immediately Martha could see the whispers begin, little eddies of conversation spreading outward from where Edna paused to speak to one woman, and then another. She saw Dorothy Marsh lean toward her husband and say something behind her hand. She saw young Clara Benton look at her with something that might have been sympathy before her mother touched her arm and steered her in the opposite direction. Martha picked up a cup of spiced cider from the refreshment table and stood as straight as she possibly could and watched the dancing. The fiddle player was good, a lean man named Horace Pittman who could draw music out of that old instrument that made your feet ache to move. The floor was full of couples turning in the lamplight, the women's skirts spreading wide as they spun, the men's boots landing solid and rhythmic on the polished boards. Children chased each other around the edges of the room. Old men sat along the back wall in cane-backed chairs and talked about the cattle prices and the state of the range and the hard winter that was surely coming. Martha watched it all and felt the particular loneliness of being surrounded by people while being utterly, completely alone. She was not invisible. That was perhaps the cruelest part. If she had been invisible, it would have been peaceful. Instead, she was entirely visible, a fixed point around which the social life of the room carefully arranged itself to maintain a certain distance. Women she had once called friends greeted her with stiff politeness and moved on. Men who might have asked her to dance in another life glanced at her, and then glanced away. She was present but untouchable, acknowledged but excluded, like a chair in a room that everyone could see but that no one quite wanted to sit in. She told herself she was fine. She told herself she had come to prove she could, and she was proving it. She told herself that other people's opinions were not the measure of her worth. She was in the middle of this very determined internal speech when the door opened and a man she had never seen before walked in. He was not the tallest man in the room, though he was not short either, somewhere in that solid range of height that suggested someone who had done real physical work for a long time without it breaking him. He wore a good hat, dark brown with a slight curl at the brim, and a vest over a clean white shirt, and the kind of boots that had seen serious use but had been recently polished for the occasion. He was somewhere around 30, she guessed, with a jaw that was slightly more angular than strictly handsome and dark eyes that moved over the room with a calm, measuring quality that suggested a man who was accustomed to taking stock of his surroundings before he committed himself to them. He was accompanied by a slightly older man, heavier and red-faced, who turned out to be Daniel Graves, who ran the largest cattle operation in the surrounding county, and who was apparently an old friend of the newcomer, because they came in together, and Daniel immediately began steering him around the room making introductions. Martha learned his name almost by accident, standing close enough to the edge of one of these introduction circles to hear it without appearing to be listening. Vernon Sutton. He had apparently ridden in from a ranch some 40 miles to the north, a spread called the Bent Creek that he had been building up for several years, and Daniel Graves was of the vocal opinion that Vernon Sutton was the finest cattleman in 3 counties and the most obstinately unmarried man he had ever had the misfortune to call a friend. 20 miles from his nearest neighbor, Daniel was telling the small group around him, which included Edna Calloway, who was looking at Vernon Sutton with the appraising expression of a woman already running through her mental inventory of eligible daughters and nieces. Lives out there with his foreman and 2 ranch hands and a dog that thinks it is a person. Comes to town maybe 6 times a year. Vernon, tell them how many rooms the house has now. Daniel, Vernon Sutton said, and his voice was quiet and a little dry, I think these people came here to dance, not to hear about my floor plan. 8 rooms, Daniel said triumphantly. 8 rooms and a proper parlor and a stove that came all the way from Chicago. Martha turned back to her cider and smiled despite herself, because there was something in the way Vernon Sutton had said that patient, slightly weary tolerance of a man who was used to being talked about but not particularly delighted by it, that she recognized from somewhere inside herself. The evening wore on. The fiddle played. The couples danced. Martha stood at the edge of the room and endured and watched, and occasionally responded to the stiff pleasantries people offered when they could not reasonably avoid her. And she thought about the walk home, and whether the night air would be cold enough to warrant the heavier shawl she had left behind. She had almost fully decided to leave when the music stopped between songs, and in the brief pause she heard something that stopped her where she stood. It was Ida Marsh's voice, not particularly lowered, carrying the way voices do when a person has stopped genuinely bothering to be discreet. She was married to that Prout man. You know what happened there. Divorced. This was a voice Martha did not immediately recognize. Abandoned, they say, though I have heard she drove him out. Either way, it amounts to the same thing. Poor man couldn't stay. Some women, you know, there's just something fundamentally, a pause artfully weighted, lacking. Damaged goods, another voice said flatly and laughed, and the word dropped into Martha's chest like a stone into still water, sending ripples through every part of her. She did not cry. She was proud of that. She set her cider cup down on the table behind her very carefully, with great precision, and she turned toward the door and began walking toward it with the measured, unhurried pace of a woman who was leaving because she chose to, not because she had been driven out. She was perhaps 10 feet from the door when she heard a voice behind her. "Excuse me, miss," she turned. Vernon Sutton was standing a few feet away, holding his hat in one hand, and he was looking at her with those calm, dark eyes that held no pity in them, which was the first thing she noticed, and no calculation either, which was the second. "I couldn't help but notice you haven't danced yet this evening," he said. Martha blinked. "I beg your pardon. The fiddle's about to start again," he said. "I was hoping you might do me the honor." She looked at him for a long moment. She was aware, in the way that you become aware of things when they suddenly matter, that the nearest cluster of women, the one that included Ida Marsh and her companions, had gone quiet. "You don't know who I am," she said, and she said it quietly, directly, not as an accusation but as a simple statement of fact. "I know your name is Martha Keating," he said. "Daniel pointed you out earlier. He said you used to teach school before the fruit business." A small pause. "He also said you were the best schoolteacher Sweetwater Creek ever had and that the current one can't spell Constantinople." Martha stared at him. "I'm Vernon Sutton," he said, as though she might not know, extending his hand. "I have a ranch up north and reportedly too many rooms in my house. I am a mediocre dancer but an enthusiastic one, and I would very much like to dance with you if you're willing." The fiddle started up again at that precise moment, bright and lively, a reel that filled the hall with immediate energy. Martha Keating looked at this man she did not know, and she looked at the door she had been walking toward, and she made a decision. "I would like that," she said, and took his hand. He danced the way he had promised, not with grace exactly, but with total commitment and a natural sense of rhythm that made up for what he lacked in refinement. He held her at the proper distance, his hand warm and solid at her back, and he turned her through the figures of the reel with an easy confidence that suggested a man comfortable in his own body, even when that body was doing something it had not done in a while. Martha found that she could still dance. She had been afraid, somewhere in the back of her mind, that she might have forgotten, that the 2 years since anyone had asked her might have rusted the memory out of her feet. But the music came up through the floorboards and into her shoes, and her feet remembered everything perfectly, and she laughed, actually laughed for the first time in what felt like a very long time, as he spun her out and then back in the final figure of the dance. When the music stopped, they were both slightly breathless, and he was smiling, which transformed his face in a way she had not anticipated. The angular jaw softened. The serious eyes lit up from somewhere behind them. He was, she realized, quite handsome when he smiled, in an unassuming, genuine way that had nothing of performance in it. "Thank you," she said, because she meant it on more levels than she could have explained. "Thank you," he said, and then, before the next song could begin, before she could make her polite excuses and retreat, he said, "Would you care to dance again?" She heard it again then, that current of awareness that ran through the nearest women. She saw Edna Calloway's sharp eyes fix on them from across the room. She saw Daniel Graves watching from the refreshment table with an expression that bordered on delighted. She also saw, very clearly, that Vernon Sutton was not looking at any of them. He was looking at her, waiting, patient and steady as a fence post, with those dark eyes that did not contain any of the usual complicated calculations of a man managing his reputation. "Yes," she said, "I would." The second dance was slower, a waltz that Horace Pittman drew out of his fiddle like he was pulling something tender and sweet up from the ground. And in the waltz there was less movement, less the glad chaos of the reel, and instead there was the particular intimacy of two people moving together in measured time, close enough to speak, close enough to notice things. "You were leaving," he said, not accusingly, just observationally. "I was," she admitted. "I'm glad you stayed a minute longer," he said. "So am I," she said, and she was surprised to find she meant it absolutely. "Daniel told me about your husband," he said, still in that same quiet, straightforward way. "The one who left." He paused. "I'm sorry that happened to you." Martha had heard variations of that sentiment before, but they had always contained within them some subcurrent of something else. Prurient curiosity dressed up as sympathy, or condescension pretending to be compassion, or that particular flavor of pity that is really about the speaker making themselves feel better. What she heard in Vernon Sutton's voice was none of those things. It was simply the honest statement of a person who had heard about a difficult thing and found it genuinely unfortunate. "It was a long time ago," she said. "It was 2 years ago," he said gently. "That's not particularly long." She looked at him. "No," she admitted. "It isn't. Does it bother you?" he asked. "Being here tonight, people talking." "It bothers me less than it did an hour ago," she said honestly. He nodded as though that made complete sense to him, and they finished the waltz in a comfortable silence that surprised her with how comfortable it actually was, silence with a near stranger usually being its own kind of awkward frontier. When the music ended for the second time, she thanked him again, and he walked her to the refreshment table, and they stood there together for a while, talking in the way that people sometimes do when they've found an unexpected ease in each other's company, about inconsequential things, and then gradually more consequential ones. She learned that he had grown up in Missouri, the third of 5 sons, and had come west at 22 with the specific intention of building something that was entirely his own. She learned that the Bent Creek Ranch had started as 200 acres and a falling-down house, and had grown over 8 years to something much more substantial. She learned that he had a foreman named Cal Ricks who had been with him from the beginning and who he described as the most competent man I know and the worst cook in the territory, and 2 ranch hands named Pete and a man everyone called Shorty who was, Vernon said with complete seriousness, 6'3". She told him about teaching school, about the 4 years she had spent in the one-room schoolhouse on the far side of Sweetwater Creek teaching children everything from their letters to basic arithmetic to the geography of places they would never see, and how much she had loved it. She told him, with less detail, about Gerald Prout, and how she had met him when he came to Sweetwater Creek as a land speculator, and how charming he had been, and how wrong she had been about what that charm was built on. She told him about losing the school-teaching position after the divorce, because the school board felt that a divorced woman was not an appropriate moral example for the children, which was a decision that still made her grip her cider cup a little tightly when she thought about it. "That's an injustice," Vernon Sutton said simply without flourish. "Yes," she said, "it is. What are you doing now for work?" "I take in sewing," she said, "and I help Mrs. Aldgate at the millinery on Thursdays and Fridays. It's enough to keep my room at the boarding house." He nodded again. He had a quality of listening that she found unusual in her experience of men, which was that he actually appeared to be doing it, not simply waiting for her to finish speaking so that he could say the next thing he had already decided to say. "How long are you in Sweetwater Creek?" she asked. "Through the weekend," he said. "There's a cattle buyer coming through Saturday that Daniel wants me to meet. I'll head back to Bent Creek on Monday morning." "That's a long ride," she said. "Not so bad," he said. "I like the open country." Edna Calloway materialized at Vernon's elbow with the practiced smoothness of a woman who had been monitoring the conversation from across the room and had decided that an intervention was required. "Mr. Sutton," she said brightly, "I believe you haven't yet met the Whitmore girls. Catherine is particularly accomplished. She plays the pianoforte beautifully." Vernon Sutton turned to Edna with perfect courtesy and said, "That's very kind, Mrs. Calloway. Perhaps another time. I'm quite enjoying my conversation with Miss Keating at the moment." Edna Calloway's expression went through several things in rapid succession, ending in a tight smile. "Of course," she said and withdrew. Martha watched her go and felt something she had not expected to feel that evening. A small, warm, rising certainty that this was a person worth knowing. They talked until the social began to wind down, until the children started falling asleep against the wall and the older couples made their goodbyes and the fiddle player packed up his instrument. And when it was finally time to leave, Vernon Sutton walked her to the door and then, because the night was clear and cold and she was going in his general direction back toward the main street, he walked her as far as the corner of Sage Street and offered to see her the rest of the way to the boarding house. She considered it for exactly 1 moment. "I would like that," she said, and they walked through the clean autumn dark together, the stars enormous and low over the western ridgeline, the town of Sweetwater Creek quiet around them, and she was aware, sharply and completely, of how long it had been since she had felt anything but braced against the world. At the gate of Mrs. Aldgate's boarding house, he stopped and turned to her, holding his hat. "Miss Keating," he said, "I'll be in town until Monday. I wonder if you might be willing to take a walk with me tomorrow afternoon, if the weather holds." Martha looked at him in the moonlight. She was aware that she was smiling, which was something else she had not expected to do this evening. "I think I might," she said. The weather held beautifully. Saturday afternoon came in golden and crisp, the kind of October day in that part of Colorado territory that made you understand why people had been willing to cross 1,000 miles of difficult country to get there. The aspens along the creek bottom had gone their full autumn gold, and the sky above them was the particular deep blue that only happens at altitude, and the air had that clarity that makes everything seem more precisely itself. Vernon Sutton appeared at Mrs. Aldgate's boarding house at 2 o'clock exactly, wearing the same vest from the night before and carrying his hat, and he brought with him a small paper bag from the bakery on Main Street that contained 2 apple turnovers, which Martha thought was an unexpectedly thoughtful thing to do. They walked along the creek path south of town, where the cottonwoods and aspens made a corridor of color above the water, and they talked. The conversation had the quality that good conversations between people who are becoming interested in each other have, that particular rhythm of revelation and response, of discovering where the edges of someone else's thinking are, and finding them either more or less congruent with your own than you expected. "I want to ask you something," he said, after they had been walking for perhaps half an hour, "and I want you to know you can tell me it's none of my business." "Go ahead," she said, curious. "Last night, when I came over to ask you to dance," he paused, choosing his words with evident care. "I had heard what those women said. I wasn't far enough away to miss it." Martha stopped walking. He stopped too, turning to face her, and she appreciated the fact that he had stopped moving when the subject required stillness. "I'm sorry you heard that," she said. "I'm not," he said, "because if I hadn't heard it I might not have understood why you were leaving, and I might not have asked you when I did." A pause. "What I want to ask is, has it always been like that? Since Prout left?" She considered the question honestly. "Since before that, even. The marriage wasn't happy, and people saw it. And when a marriage isn't happy and it's a small town, people decide why it isn't happy, and those reasons tend to stick to the woman regardless of what the truth is." "And what is the truth?" he asked, not prying, she thought, genuinely wanting to understand. "The truth," she said, "is that Gerald Prout was charming and dishonest, and he married me because I had the homestead and the teaching income, and he needed a respectable front for his land dealings. And when those dealings went wrong, he left because there was nothing left to stay for. The truth is that I worked hard and trusted the wrong person and lost almost everything I had built. The truth is that none of it was my fault, and all of it has been laid at my door anyway." She said it plainly, without self-pity, but also without the apologetic softening she usually layered over this story, the careful framings designed to make the listener comfortable, to preempt the questions, to head off the judgments. She said it the way it actually was. Vernon Sutton listened to all of it, and then he said, "That is a considerable injustice." "Yes," she said, for the second time in 2 days. "It is." "You're not damaged," he said. And he said it so directly, so without decoration or hesitation, that she felt it land somewhere underneath her breastbone like something warm. "Anyone who says that word about you is wrong, and what's more, I think some part of them knows it and says it anyway because making someone else small is easier than examining their own discomfort." Martha looked at him for a long moment. The creek moved over its stones beside them, cold and clear. A hawk tilted overhead in the blue sky. "You are a very unusual man, Mr. Sutton," she said. "Vernon," he said, "please." "Vernon," she said, and the name felt easy in her mouth. They walked further, ate their apple turnovers on a flat rock near the water, watched the light change on the ridgeline across the valley. He told her about the land at Bent Creek, about the way the country up there opened up into wide basin grassland ringed by mountains, about the winters that could come on hard and fast and the springs that arrived like a gift. He spoke about the land the way people speak about things they genuinely love, with specific detail and the kind of attention that proves you have looked at something more than casually. "It sounds beautiful," she said. "It is," he said. "It's lonely sometimes." It was the first genuinely vulnerable thing he had said, and he said it simply, without making it into a bid for sympathy, just stating a fact about his life. "Yes," she said, "I know something about that." He looked at her sideways. "I imagine you do." They walked back toward town as the sun began to angle toward the ridge, and at the gate of the boarding house he asked if she might have dinner with him that evening, at the hotel dining room if she was willing. He asked it in the same way he had asked her to dance the second time, direct and unhurried, as though whatever she said would be fine, as though the asking were its own sufficient thing. She said yes. The hotel dining room was not grand by the standards of larger cities, but it was the best establishment in Sweetwater Creek, with tablecloths that were almost always clean and a cook who could do remarkable things with a side of beef and a handful of dried herbs. Martha wore her blue calico again because it was her best dress and there was nothing for it, and she took extra care with her hair, pinning it up with her mother's tortoiseshell combs. And when she came down the stairs of the boarding house and saw Vernon Sutton standing in the parlor with his hat in his hands, she saw something move across his face when he looked at her that was not anything she had seen on a man's face in a very long time. They ate beef stew and cornbread and drank coffee that was better than the usual, and they talked for so long that the dining room emptied out around them, and the cook came out twice to see if they needed anything before giving up and going home, leaving them to the lamp at their corner table. He was funny, which she had not anticipated quite to the degree that she found it true. He had a dry, understated sense of humor that surfaced in small, precisely placed observations about people and events that made her laugh, and then made her want to hear the next one. He was also, she was discovering, deeply read for a rancher, which surprised her until he explained that the winters at Bent Creek were long and he had developed an early habit of keeping a good supply of books. "What do you read?" she asked. "Whatever I can get, history mostly, some philosophy when I can follow it, the newspapers when they're not 3 weeks old," he considered. "Daniel sent me a novel last Christmas, Mr. Twain." "Which one?" "The Adventures of Tom Sawyer," he said. "Have you read it?" "Yes, in the schoolroom actually. The children loved it." "I can see why," he said. I found myself laughing out loud alone in my house at 10 o'clock at night, which seemed simultaneously ridiculous and entirely appropriate. She laughed again, and he watched her laugh with that expression she had caught on his face before, the one that was attentive and warm and that she was beginning to realize was the way he looked at her specifically and not at other things. "Martha," he said, and the use of her given name, which she had not offered but which arrived between them with complete naturalness, "I want to be honest with you about something." "Please do," she said. "I came to Sweetwater Creek because of the cattle buyer," he said. "And I had no expectation of anything beyond that. I have been telling Daniel Graves for 3 years that I am perfectly content with my situation and that he can stop trying to arrange things." He paused. "I was not correct about being perfectly content, as it turns out. I think I had simply stopped noticing that I wasn't." Martha looked at him across the lamp. "And now you've noticed," she said. "And now I've noticed," he agreed. "Because of you, which seems to me worth saying directly." She held the words for a moment, feeling their weight and their quality. In her experience, men who said direct things about their feelings were either very honest or very practiced, and she had reason to be cautious. But Vernon Sutton had said nothing all evening, all day, that had not proven exactly as straightforward as it sounded. There was no seam where the performance was stitched to the reality. "I appreciate your honesty," she said carefully. "I'm not sure I entirely trust my own judgment when it comes to men and their intentions. You'll understand why." "I understand completely," he said. "And I'm not asking for anything beyond what's happening right now, which is a very good conversation over a meal. Whatever comes after that should come in its own time if it comes at all. She nodded slowly. That seems wise. I'm not always wise, he said, but I'm trying. They walked home through the dark again, the autumn cold settling in with a new seriousness that suggested frost by morning. At the gate of the boarding house, he thanked her for her company, and she thanked him for dinner, and there was a brief, charged moment of the kind that exists between two people who are aware of each other in a way that is accumulating into something they cannot quite name yet. He left for Bent Creek on Monday morning as he had said he would, and Martha stood at the window of her room at the boarding house and watched the street below and thought about the particular quality of a man who danced with you twice in front of a room full of people who were watching to see if anyone would, and who called an injustice by its name, and who said direct things in the lamplight without decoration. She went to work at the millinery on Thursday and spent the morning trimming hats and thinking about things she had no particular plan for thinking about. On Friday afternoon, Mrs. Aldgate knocked on her door and told her there was a letter. It was from Vernon Sutton, written in a clear, unpretentious hand on paper that smelled faintly of the outdoors. He wrote that he had made the ride home in good time and found everything at Bent Creek in order. He wrote that Cal Ricks had noticed he was in a better mood than usual and had made the accurate and irritating observation that only a woman could account for the improvement. He wrote that he hoped she was well and that the sewing was going satisfactorily, and that the current schoolteacher's inability to spell Constantinople was, in his opinion, a matter deserving of civic attention. He wrote that he would be grateful for a letter in return if she was willing, and that he understood if she was not. Martha sat on her bed and read the letter twice, and then sat for a while looking out the window at the sky above the roofline, which was going orange and rose with the late afternoon. Then she got out her writing paper and wrote back. The letters went back and forth across those 40 miles of Colorado territory over the following weeks, with an increasing frequency that Martha found both alarming and deeply pleasing. They wrote about books and weather and the small events of their days, and gradually the letters grew longer and more specific, more intimate in the way that written words sometimes allow before spoken ones would, because there is something about the fact of the blank page and the privacy of putting words to it that makes certain truths easier. She wrote to him about her mother, who had died when Martha was 15, and about the way that loss had made her both more self-sufficient and more afraid of subsequent losses. She wrote about what it felt like to stand at the edge of the Frontier Social and hear herself describe the way she had been described, and the way that hearing it still did not make her any less determined to have been there. She wrote about wanting the school teaching back, not just for the income, but because she had been genuinely good at it, and because she missed the children and missed being useful in that specific way that teaching makes you feel useful, as though you are building something that will outlast you. He wrote to her about his father, who had been a hard man with hard opinions, and about how coming west had been as much about creating distance from that as about building something new. He wrote about a winter 3 years back when they had lost 100 head of cattle to a blizzard, and how that had nearly broken both his finances and his nerve, and how Cal Ricks had sat up with him through a long bad night and talked him back from the edge of giving it all up, and how that debt was one he could never fully repay. He wrote about loneliness in a way that surprised her with its precision and its honesty, the specific texture of it, the way silence in a large house is different from silence in a small room, how company you can rely on is different from company you can have. In early November, he wrote asking if she would be willing to receive him in Sweetwater Creek over the Thanksgiving period, as Daniel Graves and his wife were hosting a gathering, and he had been invited, and he would very much like to see her again if she was willing. She wrote back that she was willing. He arrived on the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, riding into Sweetwater Creek in the early afternoon on a good-looking bay horse, and with saddlebags that proved to contain, Among other things, a jar of honey from someone's hives near Bent Creek, and a worn copy of Great Expectations that he thought she might like. She met him at the livery stable because that was where he had arranged to board his horse, and when she saw him swing down from the saddle and turn and see her and smile that smile, the one that transformed his face, she felt something click into place inside her like a piece of furniture set right. "Hello," he said. "Hello," she said. They shook hands because that was the appropriate thing in the middle of the livery stable with the groom watching. And then they walked out into the November sunshine and talked for 2 hours straight, while the cottonwoods dropped their last leaves around them. Thanksgiving at the Graves house was warm and loud, and full of the kind of complicated domesticity that large gatherings always produce. Children underfoot, too many smells coming from the kitchen, arguments about whether the gravy needed more salt, Daniel Graves holding court at the head of the table, and telling stories that grew slightly larger each time he told them. Vernon sat across from Martha at the table, and they exchanged glances at irregular intervals throughout the meal, private glances of the kind that develop between two people who have been paying close attention to each other, and have begun to develop a shared language of small expressions. After the meal, when the men went out to the porch and the women gathered in the parlor, Martha found herself sitting next to Daniel Graves's wife Eleanor, a plain-spoken, warm-hearted woman who had lived in this territory for 20 years, and who had the clear eyes and no-nonsense manner of someone who had long since stopped being impressed by things that didn't deserve it. "He's been different since he came back from the social last month," Eleanor said, without preamble, handing Martha a cup of coffee. Martha looked at her. "Has he?" "Lighter," Eleanor said. "Less like a man carrying something he won't put down." She paused. "He's a good man. One of the genuinely good ones. I say that knowing he can also be stubborn enough to make you want to throw something at him, but good underneath it where it counts." "I'm beginning to see that," Martha said. "And you?" Eleanor asked, and the question was direct without being invasive. "How are you, honestly?" Martha considered. "Better than I was," she said. "Carefully." Eleanor nodded. "Carefully is right," she said. "No shame in that." The men came back in from the porch, and the evening continued, and later, when it was time to leave and Vernon walked with Martha back through the dark toward the boarding house, there was a new quality to the silence between them, something that had been building through the letters and the afternoon and the dinner, and now had the slightly charged stillness of a thing that was very close to being said. At the gate, he turned to her. The moon was nearly full, the light of it cold and bright over the frozen street. "Martha," he said, "I have been thinking about something for several weeks, and I've been trying to decide whether it's too soon to say it." "Is it?" she asked. "I don't know," he said honestly. "That's part of what I've been thinking about." He took a breath. "I care about you, more than I expected to, and in ways I haven't cared about anyone in a long time. I'm not saying that to put any pressure on you, and I understand the reasons you have for being careful. I just wanted to say it because it's true and because I think you deserve to know what you are to me, rather than having to guess." Martha looked at him in the moonlight. This man who had come across a room full of watchful eyes and asked her to dance, not once but twice. This man who called things by their right names and listened when she spoke and wrote letters that smelled like the outdoors and brought her a book because she had mentioned once that she loved reading. "I care about you too," she said, "more than I expected to. I'm still being careful because I have reason to be, but I wanted you to know that what you said isn't one-sided." He nodded, and something in his face settled, the way country settles after a storm passes through. "Then that's enough for now," he said. More than enough. He rode back to Bent Creek on Saturday, and the letters resumed, warmer now, carrying something that had been given a name if not yet a full shape. The winter came down hard in December, the kind of hard that the old-timers nodded at knowingly, as though they had been expecting it. Snow piled up on the streets of Sweetwater Creek, and the wind off the mountains had a serious edge to it, and the world contracted to the radius of warm rooms and lamplit evenings. Martha sewed through the cold months and tended to Mrs. Aldgate's elderly aunt on Wednesday afternoons in exchange for a reduction in her boarding costs, and she wrote letters and received them. And sometimes in the evenings when the boarding house was quiet and the wind was pressing at the window glass, she took out all of Vernon's letters and read them through in order, which she recognized as something she was doing, and which she did not see any good reason to stop doing. In January, there was a stretch of 3 weeks during which no letter came, and she told herself this was because the winter roads were bad and the mail was unreliable in hard weather, which was true. She also noticed, with the kind of self-awareness she tried to practice honestly, that the absence made an impression on her days that was more significant than the impression his letter's presence had made visible, because you don't notice what fits comfortably until it's taken away. When the letter finally came in the first week of February, it explained the delay. A section of fence had come down in a blizzard, and they had lost some cattle, not as bad as the great loss 3 years back, but bad enough, and he had spent 2 weeks riding in brutal cold trying to find and account for every animal they could. He was fine. Cal Ricks was fine, though he had expressed his feelings about the whole situation in language that Vernon declined to quote. Pete had come down with a serious chest cold, and they had been worried about him for a while, but he seemed to be on the mend. And then at the end of the letter, a new paragraph. He asked if she would be willing to come to Bent Creek in the spring. He asked if she would come and see the place, meet Cal and the others, walk the land with him, and see whether it suited her. He said he was asking this because he wanted her to have a complete picture before anything further was said, because whatever came next between them should be made with full information on both sides. He said he understood that this was a significant thing to ask and that she should take whatever time she needed to answer. Martha read the letter 3 times and then sat for a long while with it in her lap, looking at the frost patterns on the window glass. In the spring, she wrote back, "I will come in the spring." Spring in Colorado Territory in 1884 arrived in installments, hesitant and then committed and then fully, gloriously present by the middle of April. Martha Keating rode north on the weekly mail coach that went as far as the junction town of Harlan, where Vernon Sutton met her with a buckboard and 2 horses, and they drove the last 12 miles to Bent Creek in the late afternoon light. She had been trying to prepare herself for the sight of it based on his descriptions in the letters, but preparation and reality are different things, and when they came over the last rise and the basin opened up before them, wide and green with new grass and ringed on 3 sides by mountain peaks still wearing their winter snow, she stopped breathing for a moment. "There it is," he said simply. "Vernon," she said, "it's beautiful." He looked at her sideways. "Yes," he said, and something in his voice suggested he was not only talking about the land. The house was solid and well built, more comfortable on the inside than she had quite anticipated. Real furniture, a proper stove, bookshelves along the main room wall that were gratifyingly full, curtains at the windows that she suspected Cal Ricks had hung against his better judgment. It smelled like wood smoke and coffee and horses and the outdoors, and it smelled like the letters. Cal Ricks turned out to be a compact, weathered man of about 45, with a face that had seen every kind of weather and a manner that was direct to the point of bluntness, which she respected immediately. He shook her hand and looked at her with an appraising quality that was not unfriendly and said, "He's been good for nothing since October. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it," and then walked away before either of them could respond. Pete was a young man of about 22, still a little pale from his winter illness, with an open, friendly face and a tendency to knock things over when he was nervous. Shorty was indeed enormous and very quiet, and clearly the most competent practical person on the property. Both of them treated her with careful, slightly formal courtesy that she found touching. She stayed for 5 days, sleeping in the small room that Vernon had clearly gone to some effort to make comfortable, with fresh linens and a rag rug on the floor and a candle holder on the bedside table. They spent the days riding the range, walking the perimeters of the property, checking on the cattle herds that were moving into the new grass, sitting in the evenings by the stove with books and conversation. She helped with cooking one night, which Cal Ricks accepted with barely concealed relief, and the dinner she produced from what was available in the kitchen was considerably better than anything that had appeared on that table in some time, which Pete said out loud and which Shorty indicated with the volume of his second helping. On the third evening, sitting on the porch in the cool dusk while the last light died over the western mountains and the stars began to come out in their full frontier abundance, Vernon Sutton put down the coffee cup he had been holding and turned to her. "Martha," he said, "I need to say something, and I want to say it right." She turned to face him. The sky behind him was going violet and deep blue. "I have been in love with you," he said, "since approximately the second dance at the Sweetwater Creek Frontier Social, which I understand sounds fast and possibly foolish, but which has only become more clearly true in the months since. I love the way you think and the way you write and the way you are honest about difficult things and the way you laugh and the way you stood at the edge of that room when those women said terrible things about you, and you did not let them see they had hurt you even though they clearly had, because you are braver than you know." He paused. "I would like to ask you to marry me. I would like you to come here and be my wife and help me build something at Bent Creek that is bigger than what either of us could build alone. But I want you to know that I'm asking this knowing everything you've told me, and I'm asking because I want you specifically, not because I want a woman for this house. There is no version of this where you would be anything less than exactly who you are." Martha Keating sat on the porch of the Bent Creek Ranch house while the stars multiplied overhead and looked at this man she had not known 6 months ago and thought about everything she had lost and everything she had survived and what it meant to be standing on the other side of it all here, in this moment, with this specific and improbable person. "I love you," she said, and the words came out steadily and completely, without the fear she had half expected. "I have been knowing it and not quite letting myself know I knew it for several months, but I do." She took a breath. "And yes, yes, I'll marry you." He reached over and took her hand, and they sat there together on the porch in the enormous starlit dark, and it was the quietest and most complete moment Martha Keating could remember in a very long time. They were married in Sweetwater Creek in June of 1884, in the small white church on the hill above the creek, on a morning of exceptional clarity when the sky was the color of the blue on fine china, and the surrounding mountains gleamed with their last traces of snow. Martha wore a dress that she had made herself over the preceding months, ivory cotton with a small blue stripe, cut simply and fitted well, and she wore her mother's tortoiseshell combs in her hair and carried a bunch of wildflowers that Eleanor Graves had gathered at dawn from the hillside above her house. She stood at the altar and looked at Vernon Sutton, who was wearing his best suit and looking at her with an expression that contained everything she needed to see, and she thought that this was what it felt like when a thing was right. Not the trembling, desperate rightness of a young person who does not yet know what wrong feels like, but the steadier, clearer rightness of someone who has been through enough to know the difference. The ceremony was brief and real. The minister, a young man named Pastor Cleary who had come to Sweetwater Creek only the year before, and therefore owed no allegiances to the social architecture that had defined Martha's recent years, spoke warmly and without condescension. They said their vows to each other in clear voices, and when it was done and Vernon kissed her, she heard someone in the small congregation begin to clap, and then it spread, and she looked out at the faces and saw Eleanor Graves beaming and Daniel Graves looking satisfied in the way of a man who has been telling everyone something for years and has finally been proven right, and Cal Ricks standing at the back with his hat in his hands and the closest thing to a smile she had yet seen on his composed face. She noticed that Edna Calloway was not present, which was its own small satisfaction. After the wedding there was a modest celebration at the Graves' house, and then in the late afternoon Vernon helped her load her trunk and her boxes into the buckboard, and they drove north out of Sweetwater Creek together in the golden June light, and Martha watched the town recede behind her and felt nothing but forward. Bent Creek in summer was a revelation. She had seen it in spring, when the new grass was coming in and the land had the fresh, slightly surprised look of a world just waking up. In summer it was fully itself. The basin grassland broad and green, the cattle visible in clusters across the distance, the mountains behind them blue and white and massive. The garden she started beside the house in the first weeks after her arrival had begun to show its first shoots, orderly rows of vegetables that she visited every morning with the same mixture of pride and anxiety that she recognized from her school-teaching days. The feeling of something alive and dependent on your attention, doing just well enough to make you nervous about continuing to do well. She and Cal Ricks arrived at an understanding within the first week that proved to be both permanent and productive. He was honest about his opinions, and she was honest about hers, and they disagreed about enough to keep the arrangement interesting and agreed about enough to keep it functional. He told her, on the second Saturday after she arrived, that she was the first person in 3 years who had made Vernon Sutton sit down and rest without being specifically ordered to, and that this was a contribution to the ranch that outranked anything she might accomplish in the garden. She started a correspondence with the Education Authority in Denver about reestablishing her teaching credentials, which had been revoked on grounds she now had somewhat more standing to contest, given that she was no longer a divorced woman but a settled, married one. The response was cautious but not closed, and she kept at it through the summer months, writing careful, well-reasoned letters that argued her case with the thoroughness of someone who had been constructing arguments her whole life. Vernon watched her do this with visible admiration and occasional practical suggestions about who to write to and what to say, based on his limited but occasionally useful experience of bureaucratic processes in the territory. "You'll get it back," he said one evening, reading over a particularly pointed letter she had drafted. "This is well argued." "I intend to get it back," she said. "I have no doubt," he said, and handed the letter back. Add a sentence in the third paragraph that references the Territorial Education Code of 1876. It specifically protects teacher credentials against removal for personal circumstances unrelated to professional conduct. She looked at him. "How do you know that?" "I read a lot," he said. "Remember," she added the sentence. The autumn of their first year together at Bent Creek arrived with its signature beauty, the aspens turning gold in the canyon below the East Range, the air sharpening toward the serious cold that would come later. Martha found herself deeply, quietly happy in a way that she turned over carefully in her mind sometimes, examining it for fragility, for the places where it might give way, and finding it solid. Not perfect, because life on a working ranch was not easy and there were difficult days and tired evenings and disagreements about practical things and the occasional moment of genuine frustration, but solid, foundational. In November, she told Vernon she was pregnant. She told him in the morning, before he went out to check on the south herd, standing in the kitchen with the coffee pot and the smell of winter coming in under the door. She said it directly, the way she said most things now, without the elaborate cushioning she had learned to build around important words during the Prout years. The look on his face was the one she kept afterward, tucked into her memory alongside the second dance and the porch in the April dusk and the morning of their wedding. He crossed the kitchen in 2 strides and held her, not frantically but thoroughly, his arms around her and his face against her hair, and neither of them said anything for a long moment. "Are you happy?" she asked, because she wanted to hear it. "Martha," he said, pulling back to look at her, and his eyes were bright. "I am the happiest man in the Colorado Territory. Possibly in the entire United States. Cal is going to be insufferable about this," she laughed. "Why?" "Because 3 weeks ago he told me that what this ranch was missing was more people, and I told him it had plenty of people, and he gave me a look and said the kind of people he meant start out small and get bigger." He shook his head. "He knew before I did." "Cal is perceptive," she said. "Cal is a menace," Vernon said fondly. She was right about Cal being perceptive. When they told him that evening, He looked at them both with the expression of a man whose forecast has proven accurate and simply said, "Good," and went back to his coffee. Pete knocked over a cup in his enthusiasm at the news, and Shorty smiled the enormous silent smile that was Shorty's version of a full celebration. The winter passed in the way that first winters in a new life tend to pass, with a particular combination of hardship and comfort, the cold pressing in from outside and the warmth being maintained from within. Not just the warmth of the stove, but the warmth of two people who have chosen each other and are finding daily that the choice was right. Martha sewed and cooked and managed the household with a competence that surprised even herself sometimes, because she had not known until she had the space for it how capable she actually was. She had always been capable, but the Prout years and the boarding house years had given her capability nowhere adequate to exercise itself. Now she had the full scale of a working ranch to organize, and she found it suited her completely. She also kept writing her letters to Denver. In January of 1885, she received a response that was formal and official, and that restored her teaching credentials in full, with an accompanying note from the regional education superintendent expressing regret that the matter had taken as long to resolve as it had. She read the letter at the kitchen table, and then she put it down and pressed both hands flat on the table and breathed for a moment. Vernon came in from outside and read the situation from the look on her face before he had seen the letter. "You got it," he said. "I got it," she said. He sat down across from her and reached across the table and took both her hands in his. "I'm extremely proud of you," he said. "That was a righteous fight and you won it." "There isn't a school near enough to teach at," she said. "Not from here." "Not yet," he said. "But this is a growing territory. These things change." She nodded. He was right. The territory was growing, ranches multiplying, families settling in. The day would come. Their son was born in March of 1885, on a night when the winter was making one last effort, and the snow was pressing against the house with a determined energy. Martha labored through it with Eleanor Graves, who had come out to Bent Creek a week before, and who turned out to be exactly the right person to have present, calm and practical and funny at exactly the right moments. Vernon was not in the room, because that was not how things were done, but he was directly outside the door for the entire proceeding, which Eleanor told Martha during the worst of it, and which Martha found both amusing and deeply comforting. The baby arrived with the particular sudden completeness of new arrivals, and the first thing Eleanor said was a boy, and a good set of lungs on him. And the second thing that happened was that the door opened very slightly and Vernon's voice said, "Martha, is everything?" And Eleanor said, "Come in, you foolish man. Everything is exactly as it should be." And he came in and saw his wife and his son, and stood there for a moment looking at both of them as though he had seen something he could not fully accommodate. They named the boy James William Sutton, William for Vernon's grandfather, who had been, Vernon said, the only member of his Missouri family who had ever looked at him without wanting him to be different. James grew with the particular speed that babies do, and the Bent Creek Ranch accommodated his presence with a seamlessness that Martha found gratifying. Cal Ricks, who had given every indication of being a man entirely without sentimentality, turned out to have a complete blind spot when it came to the baby. He was caught on 4 separate occasions making extraordinary faces at the child to make him laugh, and on one memorable morning Martha came into the main room to find Cal sitting in the large chair by the window with James on his knee, reading him, with complete seriousness, from the previous week's Denver newspaper. "He seemed interested," Cal said, not looking up. "He's 4 months old," Martha said. "You can't start too early," Cal said. Life at Bent Creek moved in seasons, each one with its own character and demands. The summers were full of cattle work and garden work and the business of the ranch, and Vernon was often away for days at a time managing the range or riding to the junction for supplies or meeting with the neighboring ranchers about the various collective concerns of cattlemen in the territory. Martha ran the house in his absence with complete efficiency and a growing contentment in her own competence that she recognized as something she was consciously allowing herself to feel, a right that she had spent too many years ceding to other people's opinions. She and Vernon argued sometimes, genuinely and substantively, about things that mattered, because they were two people with opinions, and not all of those opinions coincided. But the arguments always had a quality that the Prout years had never had, because they were arguments between equals, between two people who were arguing about the thing, and not about the underlying question of whether the other person was fundamentally all right. She had not known that distinction was possible until she had it. In the summer of 1886, a development in the surrounding region brought Bent Creek into contact with the world beyond their immediate range. A mining concern had begun moving into the northern end of the valley, and with it came a wave of new arrivals, laborers and merchants and speculators, and in their wake the territory began to look different. A small settlement was forming at the northern end of the basin, not quite a town yet, but moving in that direction. Vernon went to 2 meetings of the Ranchers' Association about it, and Martha went with him to the second one, because she had opinions about the water rights question and she said so, and he said she was right and that her opinions should be heard. And so she sat in the meeting and said them, which caused a certain amount of visible discomfort among some of the men present, but which ultimately prevailed in the argument. "You should have been a lawyer," Vernon said on the ride home. "I should have been allowed to keep teaching," she said, "but I'll take it as a compliment." The settlement at the north end of the basin was called Creekside, and by the autumn of 1886 it had a general store, a blacksmith, and approximately 40 families, which meant, Martha noted carefully, that it had approximately 40 families worth of children. She wrote a letter to the Creekside Settlement Committee, who were in the process of organizing their new community, asking whether they had considered the matter of a school and expressing her interest in the position should one be established. The response came back within 2 weeks. They had indeed considered it. They were in the process of constructing a building. Would she be available to begin in January? She read the letter sitting at the kitchen table on a cold October morning, and she thought about the school board in Sweetwater Creek that had taken her position away, and the 2 years at the boarding house, and the weight of being labeled something you were not. And she thought about the letter from Denver restoring her credentials, and she thought about the walk from the Frontier Social in the moonlight with a man she had not yet known she would love. She thought about how a terrible night had contained, in its worst moments, the seed of everything that had made the subsequent 2.5 years possible. She wrote back to the Creekside Settlement Committee accepting the position. Vernon's response when she told him was to pick her up and spin her around the kitchen, which woke James, who was in the next room, and produced a sustained protest from that direction, and which made Martha laugh loud enough to bring Cal Ricks to the door to see what the noise was. "She got the school," Vernon said. Cal looked at Martha. "Of course she did," he said, and went back to his work. The Creekside School opened in January of 1887, in a building that was still slightly unfinished at the corners, but that had a good stove and enough benches for 23 children between the ages of 5 and 14 who arrived on the first morning with the full range of expressions that first school mornings produce: terror, excitement, boredom, and in one case, a goat that followed a child through the door and had to be persuaded back out. Martha stood at the front of the room and looked at them and felt something settle back into its right place inside her, something she had been compensating for the absence of for 3 years. She taught them their letters and their numbers and the geography of places they would likely never see and the history of the country they were living in and the importance of asking questions and the validity of not knowing the answer yet. She walked the 3 miles from Bent Creek each morning in all weathers and walked back each afternoon, and on particularly bad weather days Vernon or Cal would ride out with the buckboard to meet her. James, who was 2.5 and entirely convinced he was a full participant in all adult activities, informed Cal Ricks several times per week that, when he was bigger, he was going to go to Mama's school. "You will go to your mother's school," Cal told him seriously, "and you will learn everything she teaches you, and you will not bring a goat." Vernon heard this exchange from the doorway and did not interrupt it because he felt it was proceeding well without him. The spring of 1887 brought a visit from Alina and Daniel Graves, who made the trip north to see the ranch and meet James, and spend a long, pleasant weekend in the company of people they were genuinely fond of. Alina and Martha walked along the creek one afternoon while the men talked cattle with Cal, and Alina looked at her friend with an expression of quiet satisfaction. "You look different," Alina said. "Different from when?" Martha asked. "From the social," Alina said. "From that first night." Martha thought about that first night, the cold reception, the whispers, the word that had been used, the man who had crossed a room and held out his hand. "I feel different," she said. "I feel like myself." "That's what it looks like," Alina said, and linked her arm through Martha's as they walked. "It suits you extremely well." "It suits me extremely well," Martha agreed. In the summer of that year, a woman arrived in Creekside with 3 children and no husband, her circumstances unclear, her situation evident, and the community's response mixed at best. Martha recognized the shape of the thing immediately and went a call on her within the first week. Her name was Sarah Hollies, and she was 31 and cautious and proud and frightened in the particular way of someone who has learned that relying on other people's good intentions is a risky proposition. Martha brought bread and a pot of soup and sat down at Sarah's kitchen table and talked with her for 2 hours. She told her about the school and the opening she had for a teaching assistant, which was a position she had been considering adding and which now seemed obviously necessary. She told her about the Bent Creek Ranch in Vernon and the fact that there were things you could build from scratch that would outlast other people's opinions of you. She did not say, "I know what it feels like to be called damaged." She did not need to. Sarah Hollies looked at her across the table and seemed to understand that this was a person who knew. Sarah Hollies became the teaching assistant at Creekside School in September, and she turned out to be excellent with the younger children and entirely capable of managing the arithmetic lessons, which freed Martha to spend more time with the older students. The arrangement suited everyone, and the school, which had begun with 23 children, had 31 by the end of the year as more families arrived in the basin. In November of 1887, Martha discovered she was pregnant again. She told Vernon in the same kitchen in the same way in the morning before the day began. His face did the same thing. She had been hoping for that, and she got it completely. "James will be furious," he said. "James will be delighted," she said. "James will be furious for approximately 1 week," Vernon clarified, "and then he will be delighted. I know this because James is, in all essential respects, like you." "Is that a compliment?" she asked. "It is the highest compliment I know how to give," he said. He was right about James. There was approximately a week of territorial objection from the 2.5-year-old, during which he expressed the opinion, clearly if not always intelligibly, that there were sufficient people at Bent Creek already. And then one morning he came to Martha while she was sitting with her sewing and put his small hand very carefully and very seriously on her middle, and said something that she could not quite parse, but that Cal Ricks, who was in the room, translated as, "He says he'll teach it things." "Him or her?" Martha said. "We don't know yet." "Him," James said, with complete certainty, and went back to his wooden horse. He was right. The second baby was a boy, born in June of 1888 on a summer morning when the light came into the bedroom golden and warm, and the mountains were showing clear in every direction. They named him Robert Cal Sutton, the Cal being a recognition that Cal Ricks had been as essential to the building of Bent Creek as anyone. And when this was announced, Cal Ricks went outside and stood by the corral fence for a while and looked at the mountains, and when he came back and his eyes were slightly bright, which everyone in the household agreed they had not seen before and which all of them pretended, out of respect, not to have noticed. Cal Ricks, it must be said, was utterly undone by Robert in exactly the way he had been by James, and the sight of this weathered, spare, no-nonsense man sitting in the big chair by the window with a baby on each knee, narrating the contents of the Denver newspaper to an audience that could not yet read, became one of the defining images of Bent Creek in those years. Pete, who had grown up considerably from the young man who knocked things over when he was nervous, had built himself a small house on the property, and was now the ranch's senior hand in practice if not in title. He had also, in the autumn of 1887, begun courting a young woman from Creekside named Annie Blake who worked in the general store, and the whole of Bent Creek watched this development with the invested interest of people who have limited entertainment options and wholehearted goodwill. Annie Blake was brisk and cheerful and entirely capable of managing Pete, which was the primary requirement, and they married in April of 1888 in a small ceremony in Creekside that Martha helped organize, and which Shorty attended in a suit that had clearly been acquired at some personal effort, and which fit him in the sense that it covered him, though not in any more precise sense than that. The world of Bent Creek expanded in those years, adding and building and growing the way things do when they are in the right conditions, organically, steadily, with the kind of permanence that comes from roots rather than speed. Sweetwater Creek remained 40 miles to the south, and Martha returned there occasionally, for supply trips or to visit leaner graves, and the town had changed somewhat in 4 years. New buildings, new faces, some of the old social structures shifted by the simply practical business of Western expansion. Edna Calloway had moved to Denver in 1886, which information Martha received with the composed equanimity of a woman who was too genuinely happy to take any real satisfaction in the misfortunes of those who had been unkind to her. Ida Marsh still lived there, and on one of Martha's visits to the millinery she encountered her in the street. There was a moment of complicated recognition, the kind that exists between two people who share a history that is not entirely comfortable. Ida Marsh said hello stiffly, and Martha said hello easily, and that was the extent of it. There was nothing to be fought and nothing to be won. It was simply a moment, and then it was over and Martha walked on. In the autumn of 1889, Colorado achieved statehood, which was celebrated in Creekside with considerable enthusiasm, and in Bent Creek with a dinner that Martha prepared, and that Cal Ricks declared the best he had eaten in the state, which as of that day Colorado was. James, who was 4.5 and attending his mother's school now as he had promised Cal he would, had opinions about statehood that were largely derived from what he had heard the adults say, and which he reported back to those adults with the cheerful confidence of a child who does not yet know that plagiarism is a form of cheating. Robert, who was 1.5 and into everything, attended the statehood dinner largely by attempting to redistribute its contents from the table to the floor, and was removed for this activity by his father, who had the highly developed calm of a man who has learned that small children's table manners are a long-term project. On a quiet evening in the early winter of 1889, after the boys were in bed and the house was settled, and Cal had gone to his quarters and the range lay silent under the first serious frost of the season, Martha and Vernon sat by the stove in the warm kitchen, and she looked at him across the table and thought about the entirety of what had been built. She thought about the woman who had stood at the edge of the Sweetwater Creek Frontier Social in the autumn of 1883 with her spiced cider, and her straight spine and her careful, burning pride, listening to herself be described in words she did not deserve. She thought about the way the room had arranged itself around her absence, the cold geometry of judgment. She thought about the moment she had turned toward the door, and she thought about the man who had come across the room and held out his hand. She looked at that man now, sitting across from her in the warm kitchen of the home they had built together, reading the week's newspaper with his reading glasses on, which he had acquired in the past year, and which James found endlessly fascinating, and Robert had already tried to eat on 2 separate occasions. He had a cup of coffee at his elbow and his feet propped on the edge of the stove surround, and the slight permanent crease between his brows that meant he was reading something that required following carefully. He looked up, feeling her looking at him, and found her with his eyes, and the expression on his face was the one she had been collecting since October of 1883, the one that was warm and certain and specifically for her. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "I was just thinking." "About what?" She considered how to say it. About all of it, she thought. About the road from there to here. About how different a life can look from the inside than it does from the outside, and how wrong other people's assessments can be, and how a terrible word said in a loud whisper at a social turned out to be the wrong description of a person who turned out to be more intact, more capable, more worthy of love than the people saying the word had bothered to consider. About how the worst night she had lived through in a long time contained, unrevealed, the best thing that had ever happened to her. "About the social," she said finally, "the first one when you asked me to dance." He set the newspaper down. "What about it?" "I was leaving," she said, "when you asked me." "I know," he said. "I could see it. And you asked anyway." "Yes," he said simply. "Why?" she asked. Not challenging, not complicated. Just honestly curious after all this time about the precise mechanism of the moment that had changed everything. He thought about it. He took the question seriously in the way he took most things seriously, turning it over, considering it. "Because I had heard what they said," he said finally. "And I looked at you and I saw a person who was still standing up straight after hearing it, and I thought, that is someone worth knowing." He paused. "And I thought if I let you walk out that door without asking, I would wonder about it for a long time." "And the second dance?" she asked. He smiled. "The second dance was because the first one was so good," he said, "and because I didn't want to let you go." Martha looked at her husband across the warm kitchen of their home in the state of Colorado in the winter of 1889 and felt the fullness of the life they had built settle around her like something she had always deserved and had finally completely come into. "Good answer," she said. "I have my moments," he said. "You do," she said. "You really do." Outside, the first snow of a Colorado winter was beginning to fall, quiet and thorough, covering the basin and the mountains and the range and the careful, orderly rows of the cold season garden, covering everything equally and completely the way snow does, without regard for what is valuable and what is not, without making distinctions that do not belong to it to make. Inside, the stove burned steadily. 2 boys slept down the hall. A man and a woman sat in the warm light of a lamp and the quiet company of their own good life, and it was everything, and it was enough, and it was theirs. James graduated from his mother's school in the spring of 1895, the first student of the Creekside School to complete the full curriculum, which Martha had expanded over the years to include reading, writing, arithmetic through algebra, American history, geography, and the fundamentals of natural science, drawing on the books that she had been systematically acquiring for the school library from every available source for 8 years. He was 10 years old, which meant the curriculum continued, but the completion of the first level was occasion enough for a small celebration that involved Eleanor Graves making the trip north and Cal Ricks producing, from somewhere in the depths of his quarters, a bottle of something he described only as appropriate to the occasion. Robert, who was 7 and attended the school with the slightly complicated relationship of a student whose mother is the teacher, was present at the graduation celebration and maintained throughout it the focused and slightly suspicious expression of a child who is trying to determine whether being proud of his brother is compatible with the competitive instincts of siblinghood. He ultimately concluded that it was, and said to James with complete seriousness, "I'm going to learn more than you." That, James said, with the magnificent condescension of a 10-year-old addressing a 7-year-old, is extremely unlikely. "Both of you," Martha said, "are going to sit down and eat your cake." They sat down and ate their cake. Vernon watched his sons over the rim of his coffee cup with the expression of a man who is aware that he is looking at something excellent. Bent Creek in those years was a working, living place, not the dream it had been in the beginning, but the solid reality it had become through years of work, and weather and loss and growth. They had lost cattle in hard winters and grown the herd in good summers. They had rebuilt a section of the barn when a lightning strike took part of the roof. They had expanded the house twice, first to add a proper study for Martha, where she kept her school materials and her growing collection of books, and then to add a room for each boy, because James and Robert's sharing arrangements had become untenable when Robert developed the habit of conducting loud agricultural experiments with a small plot of soil he had established in the corner of the room. Vernon had added 2 horses to the working stock and taken on a third ranch hand, a quiet young man named Thomas from further north, who had come to Bent Creek looking for work, and who turned out to be almost as capable as Shorty, which was the highest professional compliment available at that establishment. Cal Ricks, who was somewhere past 50 now and would not tell anyone exactly where, had eased himself out of the heaviest physical work with a studied casualness that fooled no one but which everyone respected by not mentioning. He managed the operations side of the ranch with an administrative thoroughness that had improved considerably since Martha had organized the record-keeping system in the first year of her marriage, a fact he had initially resisted and subsequently refused to admit had been an improvement, though everyone knew. In the summer of 1896, Vernon rode south to Sweetwater Creek on business related to a land title question that required the county records, and he came back with something he had not planned to bring back, which was a long conversation with a lawyer named Henderson, who had told him about a potential opportunity to acquire an adjacent parcel of land to the north of Bent Creek that would expand their grazing range significantly if the price could be agreed. He laid out the situation at dinner that evening: the parcel, the price, the risks, the potential. He laid it out completely and without conclusion, because this was how he and Martha discussed large decisions, both of them contributing to the shape of the thing before either of them declared an opinion. Martha asked 3 specific questions about the water rights on the parcel, 2 questions about the previous ownership, and 1 question about the soil quality in the northeast corner, and then she said, "I think we should do it if the price comes down 10%. "I think so too," he said. "I told Henderson we'd offer 10% below asking." "Then we're in agreement," she said. "We usually are," he said. "Eventually." The land acquisition went through in October, adding 400 acres to the north end of the Bent Creek Range, and giving them access to a second creek tributary that improved their water situation considerably. Cal Ricks walked the new acreage with Vernon and Martha in the autumn sunshine and said it was good land, and that the grass would come in well in the spring, and that he supposed the Suttons would need another hand now. They hired Thomas's younger brother, who turned out to be equally capable, though considerably louder. The year 1898 brought James to 13 and Robert to 10, and the school at Creekside to 47 students, which had stretched beyond what one schoolroom could contain. Martha wrote to the settlement committee, which had formalized itself into an actual town council over the decade of Creekside's growth, proposing the establishment of a second classroom and the hiring of a second full-time teacher. She had a candidate in mind: Sarah Hollies' eldest daughter, Margaret, who was 19 and had attended the Creekside school from the beginning and had shown, in Martha's experienced professional opinion, the particular gift for teaching that could not be taught. The proposal was approved. Margaret Hollies was hired. She was excellent. Sarah Hollies, who had arrived in Creekside 7 years before with 3 children and nothing, was by now the indispensable manager of the general store and the unofficial social anchor of a community that had been formed by people who knew what it was to start from nothing. She and Martha had become the kind of friends that form between people who have met each other at a particular angle of mutual recognition and have never quite let go. On a warm September evening of that year, Martha and Vernon sat on the porch of their house as they had sat on so many evenings over the 15 years of their marriage, watching the light change over the mountains and the basin go gold in the long summer dusk. The boys were in the house, James doing the mathematics that he had recently discovered he loved with an intensity that Martha recognized as the specific passion of a person finding their particular aptitude, and Robert reading something that had absorbed him so completely he had not appeared for dinner without prompting. "Do you know what I was thinking about today?" Vernon said. "Tell me," she said. "The dance," he said. "At the social. I was out on the North Range and I don't know why it came into my head, but I was thinking about that exact moment when you said yes. To the first dance or the second?" "The first," he said, "because the second you'd already decided something." "I had," she said. "What were you thinking about it?" "I was thinking," he said, "that it was the best decision I ever made going across that room." He paused. "Not because of what it led to, though what it led to is everything I have, but because of who you are. Because you deserved someone to cross the room. Because that room was full of people looking away, and I had enough sense to look toward you instead." Martha felt the warmth of it, the precise and particular warmth of being known thoroughly and loved completely by the person sitting beside her. "I was almost gone," she said. "I was 10 steps from the door." "I know," he said. "I've thought about those 10 steps." "I'm glad you were faster," she said. "So am I," he said. "Every day, every single day." The mountains in the west were catching the last of the September light, going from gold to rose to the deep violet that preceded dark, and the first stars were beginning to appear in the sky above the eastern ridge. And the sound from inside the house was Robert's voice calling James, something indistinct, and James's voice responding in kind, and the world was very good. Martha reached over and took her husband's hand, the hand that had been extended across a room in October of 1883 when the fiddle was playing, and the room was cold with judgment, and she had been 10 steps from a door. He held it, warm and steady, the way he held everything. The stars multiplied. The mountains went dark. The lamp in the house came on, yellow and warm behind the curtains, and inside it 2 boys moved through their evening and made their noise and were alive and growing and fully themselves. And outside on the porch the 2 people who had made them sat together in the quiet, which was not empty but full, entirely full, of everything that had been built from a single outstretched hand and 2 dances on a cold October night. Whatever Sweetwater Creek had said of Martha Keating in 1883, whatever words had been laid upon her like stones, they had long since been worn smooth by the passage of time and the weight of living, and what remained of that night was not the word they had used but the hand that had been held out and the decision that had been made to take it. Damaged goods. She had been none of those things. She had been, as she had always been, the finest kind of human material there is, resilient, capable, loving, and entirely deserving of a man who could see it across a crowded room and was brave enough to say so. She had gotten that man. She had built that life, and it was, in every possible measure of the word, whole.